Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, hi, I'm Hannah and thank you very much for joining me. So today we're going to talk about leather, or sewing with leather, pleather, vegan leather, whichever your choice is. I feel like that's a fabric that feels a bit daunting, and yet fashion wise it's very much in trend. It's very much something that I want to be wearing and I want to be sewing with, but it feels a bit daunting to know how to choose the right fabric, what techniques to use. So that's sort of what I want to go over in this video. I'm going to be making a pair of leather trousers, and the trouser pattern I am using is this one from Vogue. So I've made this pattern before and I will link above. It's the pink trouser video. So if you want a little bit more of an instructional video about how to make the actual trousers, then go check that one out. But this video is all going to be about the techniques I'm using and how I'm dealing with the leather. So the fabric that I have got to use is this. It's a vegan leather or fake leather or whatever you want to call it, and it's from Minerva. So I will link it below, but it was described as sort of a medium weight. It's got lots of movement to it still, but it's quite thick. It was described as having a stretch. It's a minimal stretch, I have to say. When they said stretch, I was like, oh great, it'll be fab for trousers. It's got more of a stretch on the bias, but it's got a little bit of give there, so hopefully it's got more stretch that way. Hopefully it'll be alright for some trousers. And I'm just going to go through lots of techniques and a bit of a fabric review at the end and tell you whether it was suitable or not suitable and what I've learnt along the way. So hopefully it's going to be a really good video. And I'm going to get started. Okay, so the first tips I'm going to give you are on the pattern cutting. I have laid my fabric out on the floor as so, and I have established that this length here, or this width, is where the stretch is, and that width or length there has less stretch. So for a pair of trousers you want your most stretch to be sort of horizontal, so that you've got the stretch over your bum, your thighs, that sort of thing. The length doesn't need it as much. So I want to make sure that I'm laying my pattern pieces from here and down that way. The next thing that I'm going to suggest is, a lot of the time in a pattern it says to fold over the fabric, pin it, cut out your pattern pieces. I'm going to say, because this is a much thicker fabric, we want to cut out a singular piece at a time. So I've laid this flat and not folded it over for the pattern cutting. I've laid out my first piece, and instead of pinning this I am going to use some fabric weights. So I've got one here. Basically these are just stones picked up at the beach. Mum put them together in a lovely little bag for me for Christmas. They're great if you've got one of the wheelie cutters and can do it on a cutting board, but equally for this fabric, because it's quite sturdy, it's not going to move too much when you're cutting it, you can get away without pinning it. And although a pin would go through a single layer of this fabric, it's going to be easier not to do that and a lot quicker not to do that. So I'm going to use the fabric weights and cut the pattern pieces out. So the fabric is cut out now, and the next thing that we're going to do before we do any sewing is make sure we've got the sewing machine set up right. So the first thing I'm going to do is change my needle. I have got these leather needles. They're recommended for, see if I can show you, I'll link them in the description down below. They were recommended for any thick fabrics and leather fabrics. So I believe the difference between a normal needle and a leather needle is that a normal needle is sort of cylindrical and a leather needle is more like triangular shape. So I'm going to put the leather needle in. I'm also going to use a scrap of fabric to trial it, make sure the tension's right, make sure I'm really happy with how the machine's stitching, because it is a thicker fabric than I'd normally put through, and especially when we're doing things like the waistband, there might be 3-4 layers of fabric going through at once, and you want to make sure that your machine's set up right and able to cope. Okay, so as I said earlier, if I were to pin everything, the pins do go in, they're a little bit stiff, but you create sort of a bump, which will be really hard for like being accurate and lining up your fabrics. Also, when the pin is taken out, if you can see there, let's try and focus it, you're left with little pinpricks holes, which isn't ideal. So I've got a little solution instead of this for when using leather. Okay, so my solution is I have bought these little sewing clips, if you can see there. So what they are just little plastic clips. They were, I think I spent about £4 on Amazon and got 100, 200, something like that. Absolutely plenty for what we need. And so instead of pinning the fabric together, you can just clip the fabric together along the seam line and then just take them out as you go along sewing, and these won't leave any marks or any bumps in the fabric as you're going along and lining things up. Okay, so ironing the fabric. Leather, once garments made, is probably not something you'll need to iron, but when making anything you kind of want to create accurate creases and iron things in place. So what I'm going to say is that there's no reason why you shouldn't iron it, but anything you're concerned about ironing, always iron with a clean tea towel on top and start at a low heat and get hotter as you're sort of looking and seeing how the fabric's reacting. So ironing wise, it's got a lot of bounces with fabric, but I have managed to get a crease down there which folds nicely, and it will just need holding in place with some clips when I'm stitching it. So what I had in the end was the tea towel on top, and I worked the iron up to a cotton temperature. My iron is one where I can change the temperature, not all you can, but if you've got that possibility, then make sure you start low, work up and see what works for you. But that's definitely creased it enough for what I need, and I can carry on with the sewing now. I've got to the point of the main construction of like stitching down the legs, and I wanted to show you the technique that I'm going to use. So I'm going to do what's called a run and fell seam, which if you're wearing jeans, have a look at the inside seam on your jeans, and that is a run and fell seam. So it's used quite a lot because it's a double stitched seam, but it will also hide a raw edge, which the main plus side to using leather is actually because it doesn't fray. You don't have to worry too much about the raw edges, but because it's quite a strong fabric and I want to fit it quite slim to the leg, I want to make sure that it's double stitched for the extra strength. So the first stage of doing this run and fell seam, wait for it to focus, there we go. The first stage of doing this run and fell seam is to stitch down the seam allowance, and you want wrong sides together, so the right side of the fabric facing out. So I'm going to do a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance and stitch down the inside of the leg. Okay, so I have stitched wrong sides together along the inside seams, and now what I'm going to do is one side of the seam allowance, I'm going to make sure this is the side towards the back, and I am going to trim this down so there is about 0.5 of a centimetre left, and then you leave the other side nice and long. We have one side that's cut down and one side that's long. So how we then stitch the second line of stitching is we fold the long side over the short side, lie it flat, and then stitch along here. I'll pin a little bit in place and then you can see what I mean. Okay, so that is how it sits. pop the pin in there. I'm in two minds on whether I'm going to pin this or whether I am going to just sew it really slowly and fold it as I go. I'll let you know which I do. But sadly I can't use my little clips for this bit. But that should make a really strong, neat double stitch seam for the inside of the trousers. Okay, so that is the finished seam. So as you can see, you have your first line of stitching, which is pretty much invisible after your second line, and then your second line goes on top where it has been folded. I'm going to do this for the other side, and then we'll probably do exactly the same stitching around the crotch, because if you think about it, if you've ever had a pair of trousers rip, it's going to be either the inside seam or the crotch seam. So it's just about strengthening those and making sure that they're sturdy enough for the fabric type. Okay, so I'm on to the waistband now, and the trousers are going very, very well. But I wanted to give you another top tip. So because this is quite bouncy fabric, when I want to iron a seam flat, if it's not staying flat, one thing that you can do is top stitch it. So this is one of my waistband seams. As you can see, I've stitched down the middle and then I have top stitched it so that this lies nice and flat and it won't produce any bulkiness or anything like that in the waistband. Hey guys, so it's about 6 o'clock in the evening now, and I have just finished my trousers. So they actually went very, very well. This is the finished pair. They're very much the style and shape that I was after, very, very similar to the ones on Pinterest that I'd seen and fell in love with. So I'm really, really, really pleased with these. So as far as the fabric, I want to sort of do a proper little fabric review for you, because leather was something that I was terrified about buying the wrong thickness, like leather without enough stretch in it, whether it would be right for trousers, not right for trousers. The fabric that I've gone for actually works really, really well for trousers. It's got a lot more stretch than I was expecting, so I've got a really, really good fit, but also I can very, very easily sit down in them, which is always a bonus. So very, very happy with this. It's quite a thick fabric. The only worry that I've got is whether they're going to get a little bit warm and sweaty. But having not owned a pair of leather trousers before, I don't know whether that's normal. I'm assuming it is, because it's not the most breathable fabric ever, but they'll be great for when you're worried about being too cold. They're really, really lovely trousers to put on, and you still feel super, super stylish in them. So very happy with that. I'd say the fabric that I bought would be great for any trousers of any shape and style. Your skirts, things like dresses, or even like leather jackets. If you want something that's a little bit more movable in and less structured, this fabric would be incredible for it. As far as actually making the garment, I'd say it's one of my favourite fabrics I've ever sewn with, because you've not got to worry about the seams fraying. It doesn't fray at all. There's lots of give in it, but then it kind of keeps its shape whilst you're sewing it through a machine, which is always a bonus. As far as the pins, that was a little bit difficult. In some places I used pins, in some places I used the clips, which were actually fantastic, especially for hemming the bottom of the trouser. I got Chris to sort out the length for me, and normally he wouldn't do that because he doesn't like putting pins in and he finds it all a bit difficult and a bit stressful. But those clips were fantastic for that. I don't know why I haven't owned them already, if I'm honest. But yeah, I'd say leather is nowhere near as daunting to sew with as I expected. Oh, also the sewing machine needle went through absolute dream. Didn't have any issues with the sewing machine bulking up or getting stuck anywhere, as long as you make sure your tension's right and you go for a slightly longer stitch length if you're going through a lot of layers. Yeah, it actually went really, really well. So I hope you've enjoyed, I hope you've learnt something, and I hope you enjoy all your sewing with leather, and let me know of any projects that you're aiming to do. I'll see you in the next one. Bye!